I'm interrogating beings themselves because they're who I ask, right? The criminal, so to speak, being itself is nowhere to be found, but I can interrogate the beings to try to find out if they know where being is, right? Yeah. So what Heidegger is saying, right? Definitions are limiting, right? So they perform this function of cutting up, dividing up, pulling into within limits. But being is that universal whole or unitary structure is precisely what cannot be limited or defined. Therefore, right, on the one hand, it's true that being is indefinable, but rather than that saying, it's not something that we should look into, or it's not really a question for us, it's actually becomes an even more important question, right? Because we have to invent some new kind of way of doing philosophy that would make it possible to understand or think a concept which cannot be defined and which does not give itself over to limiting, to think without limit or something like that. The third prejudice is that being is the self-evident concept, right? And I guess I didn't take any notes down for that, which I should have, but right, I mean, it's kind of, I think what he says is something to the effect of being is so we have a vague everyday understanding of being, and that's true, but when you start actually trying to formalize it, you realize that we actually don't have an understanding of being, and therefore it's not self-evident. And anyway, since philosophy can't reside on or persist on just accepting things as self-evident, it's about finding a grounding structure for the sciences or something like that, for the general sciences. We can't just take things for given as self-evident. So of course, another reason that not only does this prejudice not suggest that we shouldn't study being, and in fact makes our goal to study being all the more important. Okay. Let me try something. Okay. So the structure of a is what Heidegger moves on. First was this kind of prejudices. So the first question is, what are the three prejudices? Or the first section. And the second section is, how do we formalize the question? And he talks about the structure of the question in general, not just the question of being, but any question is one. And he's doing a certain sort of etymological play to dig out these parts of the question. One, the formal structure of a question is that it's a seeking, right? That when you ask something, there is something which is sought after, right? There's kind of a question's not just asked into a void. There's something to which you address your question or what you're after in the question. Second is interrogating, right? That there's something you're seeking after something and you're also interrogating something, right? So if you think of it in like detective terms, you might be seeking the criminal but interrogating someone else, right? And that's kind of the person you investigate to find the other thing. So there's a certain maybe transcendental way here, it seems like, where you have the thing interrogated and the more primary thing behind it. So and he gives, right after he explains the structure of the question, the elements in being that apply to these structures. So one, seeking, right, what is sought, or what the questioner who asks the question of the meaning of being is seeking after, is the fact of being. They're always already inside of being, right? One experiences, I experience my having of being, my always already being inside of being, and being how I experience the world, right? I experience that the world already is. There's a certain isness to the world. I'm seeking the meaning of that, right? That's what I seek, is this very fact of being. What I interrogate are beings themselves, right? But so it's important to note that these are not the same thing, right? That what I'm seeking is the fact of being, or the isness, the is of the world out there, right? And that's really not the same thing as beings themselves, which is a point that Heidegger is going to emphasize over and over and over. I'm interrogating beings themselves because they're who I ask, right? The criminal, so to speak, being itself is nowhere to be found, but I can interrogate the beings to try to find out if they know where being is, right? The third part of a question is ascertaining, right? So it's this is what you get from the witnesses if you interrogate them, is you ascertain something about what you are seeking, right? And so what we're trying to ascertain, or trying to figure out in the question of the meaning being, is we're trying to conceptualize the meaning of the being on its own terms. Specifically, that means being not in terms of beings, but being as being on its own terms. And then finally, all questions, Heidegger suggests, are determined, at least in part, by the being of the questioner, right? That the questioner has a certain mode of being, and that mode of being determines how they ask the question to begin with. And of course, what's most relevant for us as humans asking the question of the meaning of being is that we ourselves are Dasein, right? That we have their being, that we are that being for which being is an issue. So that's where we left off, is the structure of a question. And he closed the section by saying that he was that this structure of the question, or this attempt to formalize it, already made clear that Dasein has a special relation to this question, because Dasein is that being for which being is an issue, right? Dasein in particular has a particular concern with being. It's humans in particular who have a tendency to ask the question, why am I here? What is it all for? Things like that. But he hasn't shown, he says, any reason that Dasein should have priority in asking this question, or investigating being. But he says he's going to show that now, and in both ontological and ontic. And obviously ontological is a general term, which is something like, you know, the study of what is, i.e. the study of being, right? I mean, because that's what being is what is. Right. You know, being in German, like I said last time, is the same word as is. They're both sein. So, you know, to study what is and to study being, they're the same thing. And in English they are too. It just doesn't have that clarity in the language. And ontic, I don't know if Heidegger invented this term or if it had an older history in philosophy, but it's certainly a word that many people associate with Heidegger now. And, you know, we might just read the text and let him define it. But it's kind of the opposite of ontological, the other side of this binary. Because ontological is sort of dealing with, in a way, abstract, although I think Heidegger wants to not be abstract. Sorry. These bigger questions of being, because ontic is supposed to be, in contrast to that, it's the like the everyday lived experience and things like that. The what is kind of obvious maybe about being, or I'm not sure quite what I want to say about that. So maybe that's why I'm just gonna let Heidegger say it himself in the text, and we can get back to it. Okay, so that's good enough for a sum up of last time, and we can get back into the text. So this is where we left off. The ontological priority of the question of being. And I will read this. Despite the fact that I have a PDF, I actually do have the physical book. Both of them, actually. I brought the other translation as well in case we need to look at it. And I think I'll read it out of the book. This might be easier. So that's what I'll do. Okay, so section 3, the ontological priority of the question of being. The characterization of the question of being under the guideline of the formal structure of the question as such has made it clear that this question is a unique one, such that its elaboration and even its solution require a series of fundamental reflections. However, what is distinctive about the question of being will fully come to light only when that question is sufficiently delineated with regard to its function, intention, and motives. Right? So that's we're getting another kind of it's so different from the later Heidegger work. We're getting this preliminary sketch of what the section is going to be, right? We're going to talk about function, number 1, number 2, intention, and number 3, motives, right? So let's pull up our document. So we can put it in these terms, right? We'll do the function intention, and motives. Woo! We're ready. We're ready for the function, intention, and motives. Oh yeah. The characterization of the question of being under the guideline of the formal structure of the question is such as to make clear that this question is a unique one, such that its elaboration and even its solution require a series of fundamental reflections. Right. So yeah, again, we're still even. This is formalized the points of the question of being, but to study the ontological question of being, we still can't even elaborate it yet because we need to dig out the ontologic. I mean, it's interesting he says reflections, right? In the sense of, German idealism is like, catching what the mirror throws back and catching that throwing back itself in the mirror, right? That reflection. So we're gonna break it up, right? Basically, how this we're gonna have some fundamental reflections on being, on ontology itself, and that's gonna ground us for thinking about the question. So we can go on. Up to now, the necessity of a retrieval of the question was motivated partly by the lack of a definite answer, even by the lack of any adequate formulation of the question, right? So, right, I mean, so what we're talking about, right, and that's kind of how Heidegger responded to the prejudices, showing how what makes them arguments for rather than against the importance of investigating being is precisely the fact that what do I want to say? That they actually, rather than seeming answered or unanswerable, they are unanswered, and in a way that poses serious problems until we can answer them, right? But one can demand to know what purpose this question should serve. Does it remain solely, or is it at all, only a matter of free-floating speculation about the most general generalities? Or is it the most basic and at the same time most concrete question, right? And that seems like a pretty straightforward rhetorical question. Obviously, he thinks it's the latter, right? It's precisely not these kind of generalizations or overarching ideas about what in the abstract metaphysical kind of way, what can we say beings are? What is this empty concept? It's about, no, what is the most concrete experience, basic question that drives in on our basic everyday experience. He says, let's move down. Being is always the being of a being, right? The being of a being, right? So in certain ways, it sounds like, at least in that formulation, it's predicative of being. But, it's something concrete, right? It's not abstraction. It's not logic in the conventional sense. It's not metaphysics. It's a real concrete lived experience, like phenomenological lived experience. The totality of beings can, with respect to its various domains, become the field where particular domains of knowledge are exposed and delimited, right? So it is fundamental in some way, right? Where you do have that limiting, and you break off the various sciences, and you have a sense by looking at the totality of beings, where we draw the kind of dividing line or splits between different sciences. These domains, for example, history, nature, space, life, human being, language, and so on, right? So these could be majors in a university. It also could just be any kind of inquiry in these ways, can in their turn become thematized as objects of scientific investigations. Scientific research demarcates and first establishes these domains of knowledge in a rough and ready fashion. The elaboration of the domain in its fundamental structures is in a way already accomplished by pre-scientific experience and interpretation of the region of being to which the domain of knowledge is itself confined. Right, so I don't think he's suggesting that, there's no work being done in a particular domain, like say biology or something, but it's that the fundamental concerns, right, that we study, I should have talked about something I know more about. I don't really know much about biology, but in biology, right, I think I could be wrong, you don't talk about chemicals, right? That's for chemistry, which is on this level lower than biology. Biology, you talk about cells, you talk about organisms, it's like these different ways in which the world can be, or modes of being in which the world can show up. That's kind of phenomenology, different ways they can appear to you. And okay, that's good to know. Okay, so you do talk about chemistry and biology. So it's a bad example then. Right, but that there's different ways, and also hello, welcome, some goner. Right, but there's different ways in which you can break up the world phenomenologically. What Heidegger is saying, I think, if I take this sentence, if I'm taking this sentence correctly. Oh, interesting. Okay. So do you think that there's a meaningful reason for biology being a different department than chemistry? Like why major in why does the university separate out biology and chemistry, do you think? If you have an answer, I'd be curious to know. Because it's interesting in the context of kind of what he's talking about here with how do you yeah, that's true, both are like base subjects, yeah, and I guess they're still like they're interrelated, but they still have different concerns maybe, and that's why you can have different classes for biology and classes for chemistry or something like that makes sense to me. Yeah, and this is kind of what Heidegger's talking about. How do you divide up knowledge? How do you break it up into the different disciplines? And so he says, right, the elaboration of the area in its fundamental structures is in a way already accomplished by pre-scientific experience and interpretation of the domain of being to which the area of knowledge is itself confined, right? So, there's certain basic yeah, right. There's certain basic views you have to already have about the world, or not even about the world, but about what you're looking for, right? If I'm asking a question about physical, like what if I look at a book as what are the physical properties of it, right? Then I can look at it as an object of physics, right? If I look at it as what are the chemical properties of this book, I can look at it as a chemist. If I ask what is the meaning of this book, I can look at it as a literary scholar. If I ask what is the publishing world that it's involved in, I can look at it as an economist. There are different questions that you ask that are how you divide up the world, I think is what he's saying, right? So that's the sense in which it's pre-scientific, is that you already have a goal of why you're looking at something, and that goal already determines in part the kind of work that you're going to do scientifically. So he says, the resulting fundamental concepts comprise the guidelines for the first concrete disclosure of the area. And that's, yeah, exactly, different perspectives or aspects, right? Because Heidegger is pushing back against the older philosophical view that, you can just figure out what a thing is in itself. Yeah, very long-winded. This book is notoriously confusingly written. But right, so the old philosophical view is that things just kind of, you can figure out the real definition of what something is. But Heidegger thinks you actually have different definitions based on what perspective you look at it from. It actually kind of changes what the thing is based on which perspective you're looking at it. All right, so that's what he means by disclosure. It discloses itself in different ways, but it's concrete, so it's still, strictly speaking, it's reality. It's not just abstraction. It really is different in a certain way. Okay. Let's move over to page 8. We made it. Oh no, page 8's over here. Okay. So whether or not the importance of the research always lies in such establishment of concepts, its true progress comes about not so much in collecting results and storing them in handbooks as in being forced to ask questions about the basic constitution of each area. These questions being chiefly a reaction to increasing knowledge in each area. So let's see what's going on there. Right. Okay. So yeah. So on the one hand, you build up concepts over time, right? Like you have an idea of a cell, and that helps you learn certain things about how organisms function, how their bodies function. You develop different concepts over time, and that's an important part of the development of science. But he's saying that these basic changes over time offer real shakeups, I guess, in the development of a science. So I guess an example, like a famous example, would be the switch in physics, which isn't so much a switch, really. I think my understanding is that that's not the best way of thinking about it, but that there is this switch or big event when Newtonian understanding of physics gets challenged by like an Einsteinian view of physics, which isn't that we stop using Newton's laws or anything like that, but it changes somewhat the view that we used to have about the basic things that held true for absolute certain in the universe, right? I mean, what you realize that for Newton's laws still hold true for most applications, right? But once you start getting into quantum mechanics, those laws really don't hold anymore, right? So that's one basic change at the fundamental level of a discipline. The real movement of the sciences takes place in the revision of these basic did I already say that? Oh no, it's just kind of he's repeating what I was already saying. The real movement of the revision of the sciences takes place in the revision of these basic concepts, a revision which is more or less radical and lucid with regard to itself. A science's level of development is determined by the extent to which it is capable of a crisis in its basic concepts. So that's kind of interesting. That's like there's a certain a Darwinian element there, in the sense that, survival of the fittest is survival of the ability to survive critique or challenge or something like that, right? That what makes physics so strong and that's made it last so long is that even when you have a crisis as big as the Einsteinian challenge to Newton's laws, the discipline comes out stronger in a certain way. It's not it's a little bit of a crisis, but it's a crisis that it works through and that it comes out on the other end stronger for, right? So that's interesting to put it that way. In these imminent crises of the sciences, the relation of positive questioning to the matter in question becomes unstable. Today, tendencies to place research on new foundations have cropped up on all sides in the various disciplines. And especially since around the time that he's writing this, psychology is new and very trendy, and like people like Freud are popular. He might be looking towards that and kind of, crapping on psychology a little bit and saying, it's unlike physics or chemistry or biology or philosophy or history or whatever. There are these very old, long, historical disciplines that have a lot of strength, right? He seems to think maybe psychology is on a weaker foundation or something like that. I guess maybe sociology also would be one that was new at that time. That would be my guess, what he's talking about when he's talking about research on new foundations that don't have that strength and ability to withstand crisis of longer disciplines. Or sorry, not longer, older disciplines. So let's keep reading. The discipline which is seemingly the strictest and most securely structured, mathematics, has experienced a crisis in its foundations. The controversy between formalism and intuitionism centers on obtaining and securing primary access to what should be the object of this science. Relativity theory in physics grew out of the tendency to expose nature's own coherence as it is in itself. As a theory of the conditions of access to nature itself, it attempts to preserve the immutability of the laws of motion by defining all relativities. It is thus confronted by the question of the structure of its pre-given area of knowledge, that is, by the problem of matter. In biology, the tendency has awakened to get behind the definitions that mechanism and vitalism have given to organism and life, and to define anew the kind of being of living beings as such. In the historical and humanistic disciplines, the drive toward historical actuality itself has been strengthened by the transmission and portrayal of tradition. The history of literature is to become the history of critical problems. Theology is searching for a more original interpretation of human beings being toward God, prescribed by the meaning of faith itself and remaining within it. Theology is slowly beginning to understand again Luther's insight that its system of dogma rests on a foundation that does not stem from a questioning in which faith is primary and whose conceptual apparatus is not only insufficient for the range of problems in theology, but rather covers them up and distorts them. Right, so right there he's kind of just running through a bunch of disciplines and talking about this in more concrete terms. Right, so that's a good point that he brings up, that really kind of the oldest, along with philosophy, but they're not really separated, especially in ancient Greece. They're both the same discipline. The oldest is mathematics, right? And that's kind of the oldest and the strongest of all the disciplines. It seems like he's saying here is mathematics, right? And the controversy between formalism and intuitionism is something that was going on in the 19th century that he's responding to. And it was a debate about what numbers are. It's like not, I don't think it has the same weight today that as much as people cared about it back then. But it's like a question of can I, even if it's a very, very simple equation like 2 plus 2 equals 4, do I have a knowledge that completely independent of me, there is the truth 2 plus 2 equals 4, which I think would be closer to my view, is formalism, or is it somehow tied to how our brains work? That was, which it would be intuitionism, right? That our brain has some kind of capacity in it that structures things in a certain way. That's why we think 2 plus 2 equals 4. The equations that we do work, which sounds kind of wild, but some people did believe it. And some people still believe it today, I guess. That say an alien that had a totally different brain would have a different math also. So that's the debate between formalism and intuitionism that he's talking about, which was, it was a raging debate in math in the 19th century. It's not as popular today, right? But but when you're having a debate like that about what numbers are, that's a fundamental debate, like what he's talking about. It's a crisis in its foundations, right? And then obviously the example I gave, which I think is a more relevant example today, the switch from Newtonian mechanics in physics to relativity after Einstein and development of quantum theory. Actually, let's reread that sentence again. As a theory of the conditions of access to nature itself, it attempts to preserve the immutability of the laws of motion by defining all relativities. It is thus confronted by the question of the structure of its pre-given area of knowledge, that is, by the problem of matter. Right? So again, like in math, where the question is, what are numbers? Right? This like fundamental basic question you have to ask to do math. The question here is, what is matter? Which is a similarly basic question for physics. That, it's not always being asked. Most of the time, you just assume that and you work with it. It's not even that that's bad. It's good. It's important to do that because you can't keep asking these fundamental questions all the time, or you'd never be able to do basic science every day. But sometimes something happens in history that forces a crisis where you have to think about that basic thing, right? And that's what happens in the breakthrough of relativity in physics, is that now we have to reassess and reevaluate what we even think matter is. So these are examples of him showing his argument, both that the real breakthroughs, every time there's a real breakthrough in the history of a science, that real breakthrough comes from something that forces us to re-examine our basic fundamental assumptions that undergird a discipline. And also the other thing that the stronger a discipline is the longer that it lasts. And the more crises it survives, the stronger and stronger that discipline is. In biology, the tendency is awakened to get behind the definitions of mechanism and vitalism. And that's also kind of a debate that was happening at the time. That's not so much happening today, right? But what exactly is life was a debate as well, right? There's the losing side of that is people like Henri Bergson, who thought that life was the élan vital or things like that, and that was really we don't need to go into that, but that was a debate that was happening also at the time in biology. What is life? Another obviously fundamental debate. In the historical and humanistic disciplines, the drive toward historical actuality has been strengthened by the transmission and portrayal of tradition. The history of literature has become the history of critical problems. Right. So same thing with history or literature. You have this long tradition of views that are being preserved across their history of their disciplines, right? And what becomes the important history of them, or that makes the discipline strong, is its ability to weather and respond to questions that come up in terms of how literature should be interpreted, whether we should interpret literature, what literature is, things like that. We talked about theology. Luther's insight was referring to Martin Luther, right? The Protestant Revolution. Luther's insight that its system of dogma rests on a foundation that does not stem from a questioning in which faith is primary, and whose conceptual apparatus is not only insufficient for the range of problems in theology, but rather covers them up and distorts them, right? So in a certain way, he's saying that theology is kind of failing at the moment because as an aspect of its adherence to faith or whatever, right, it's not willing to examine its foundations or to question its foundations. It's not willing to let itself have the kind of crisis that could save it, right? So it's he's being critical of theology there. Yeah. So that was good. That was a helpful paragraph. It gave examples across almost every major discipline. So we can keep reading. Fundamental concepts are determinations in which the area of knowledge underlying all the thematic objects of science attain an understanding that precedes and guides all positive investigation, right? So if the work that you're doing every day as a scientist in a lab or a classroom or whatever, that's being defined here as positive investigation, developing new knowledge, positive production of new concepts and ideas, right? But the fundamental concepts, yeah, it's rough, but we're working through it slowly, trying to make it work. Thanks for stopping by. But so fundamental concepts are those are the things that change, right? That the kind of negative work that rethinks or shakes up the ground and rethinks the ground in which those positive investigations happen. Those are the real moments of shift or break in the history of a discipline. So it's really interesting, actually, if Heidegger ends up sounding a lot like Thomas Kuhn here, right? The physicist turned philosopher, turned both at the same time. So it's very interesting. Accordingly, these concepts first receive their genuine evidence and grounding only in a correspondingly preliminary research into the area of knowledge itself. But since each of these areas arise from the domain of beings themselves, this preliminary research that creates the fundamental concepts amounts to nothing else than interpreting these beings in terms of... Let's get over here. The basic constitution of their being. This kind of investigation must precede the positive sciences, and it can do so. The work of Plato and Aristotle is proof of this. Right, so how the beings are constituted, like we were talking about, is determined in a certain way by this preliminary work of dividing up the disciplines. And he thinks that Plato and Aristotle, I guess, did this. Laying the foundations of the sciences in this way is different in principle from logic limping along behind, investigating here and there the status of a science in terms of its method. Such laying of foundations is productive logic in the sense that it leaps ahead, so to speak, into a particular realm of being. discloses it for the first time in its constitutive being, and makes the acquired structures available to the positive sciences as lucid directives for inquiry. Thus, for example, what is philosophically primary is not a theory of concept formation in historiology, nor the theory of historical knowledge, nor even the theory of history as the object of historiology. What is primary is rather the interpretation of genuinely historical beings with regard to their historicality. Similarly, the positive result of Kant's critique of pure reason consists in its approach to working out what belongs to any nature whatsoever, and not in a theory of knowledge. His transcendental logic is an a priori logic of the realm of being called nature. Right, so there's something important happening here, which is that Heidegger is dividing this thinking of being from logic, right? The logic in the technical sense, in terms of like what Aristotle was doing, formal logic, right? Because logic, and I think this is an interesting point also, because it's a space for thinking about this division between analytic philosophy and continental philosophy. That when you have analytic philosophy, you do philosophy of science. And that's important, right? Because you're doing things like Bayesian reasoning. You're thinking about, what makes good evidence and what distinguishes it from bad evidence. How likely can we, what truth value can we assign to a proposition? That's investigating, as Heidegger's saying here, that's investigating science in terms of its method. So it comes after science. But this, Heidegger suggesting, this thinking of being comes before science, right? Because it lays the foundation. It's a productive logic. It leaps ahead into a particular realm of being, right? And so if it's the first time that you do that, or if you're Einstein and for the first time you're inventing relativity, that's for the first time opening up a new realm of being, disclosing constitutive being. So it's not quite like constructing being, right? Because it's just opening a new way, disclosing a new possibility for being to become available to us. Thus, for example, what is philosophically primary is not a theory of concept formation in historiology, right? So it's not, so obviously he's explicitly disagreeing with Deleuze here. For example, what is philosophically primary is not a theory of concept formation, right? Deleuze thinks that philosophy is the production of concepts, whereas it seems like Heidegger thinks that's more science and metaphysics and things like that. Nor the theory of historical knowledge, nor even the theory of history. This may also be a response to Hegel, but I'm not sure. It's not a theory of concept formation. It's not a theory of historical knowledge, nor even is the theory of history as the object of historiology. What is primary is rather the interpretation of genuinely historical beings with regard to their historicality. I guess what's going on there is that thus, for example, what is philosophically primary? So I guess in historial, let's go to our trusty Google, actually, because I don't feel, I think historiology would refer to like the study of history, but I'm not really sure. Yeah, the study or knowledge of history. So if it's not concept formation in historiology, Thus, for example, what is philosophically primary is not a theory of concept formation in historiology. A theory of concept formation in historiology. I don't know. If anyone in the chat has ideas, feel free to shout it out there, because I'm struggling with that one a little bit. Thus, for example, what is philosophically primary is not a theory of concept formation in historiology, nor the theory. So I guess the theory of historical knowledge would be like historians have historical knowledge, and philosophers of history, like I guess Hegel, for example, have theorized that possibility of that historical knowledge. But that's not what Heidegger thinks that is. And I guess that's closer to that kind of idea of logic limping along behind, investigating the knowledge. It's not a theory of concept formation in historiology, right? So it's also not a theory of how concepts are formed in history, nor the theory of the knowledge as such, nor even the theory of history as the object of historiology. I guess history in relation to the study of history. What is primary is rather the interpretation of genuinely historical beings with regard to their historicality, right? So I guess it's a response to the kind of top-down view of Hegel of history being, above determining being, right? It's rather starting at the bottom, which is more phenomenological, without a system, starting with the beings as they are, letting the things show themselves as themselves. It's starting with the beings, which are themselves historical, and working your way back to the historicality, I guess. But I don't really know why history is showing up there, since it doesn't seem to me like Heidegger's concern with being is historical, at least so far. But maybe it is, I'm not sure. Similarly, the positive result of Kant's critique of pure reason consists in its approach to working out what belongs to any nature whatsoever, and not in a theory of knowledge. His transcendental logic is an a priori logic of the realm of being called nature. Right. So I guess this is the comparison between what Heidegger's doing and what Kant was doing in the critique, right? His approach is to working out what belongs to any nature whatsoever. It's not a theory of knowledge, in that sense, right? It's about working out something external, right? Something that's true, and it's true that our knowing is involved in it, but it's something independent of our knowing. It's the known, which is attempted to get to, maybe. His transcendental logic is an a priori logic of the realm of being called nature. Yeah. So it's an a priori logic, which is the sense in which it leaps ahead and opens a new realm for being. So, okay, so I don't feel like I understand that perfectly, but that's something to go off of. Okay, so we can keep moving it, and if we need to, we can come back to it. But such inquiry, ontology taken in its broadest sense without reference to specific ontological directions and tendencies, itself still needs a guideline. It is true that ontological inquiry is more original than the ontic inquiry of the positive sciences. Okay, so that's something we can actually modify. It's not just the everyday lived experience that ontic is. It's also what is studied in the sciences, right? It's right, it's the more practical, right, rather than the more fundamental structures. I would say as empirically available also. But such inquiry, ontology taken in its broadest sense without reference to specific ontological directions and tendencies, itself still needs a guideline. It is true that ontological inquiry is more original than the ontic inquiry of the positive sciences, but it remains naive and opaque if its investigations into the being of beings leave the meaning of being in general undiscussed. Right? And I think that's the failure of metaphysics for Heidegger, that it talks about the being of beings, but not in any meaning of what it says to say the being of beings. It just takes that meaning for granted, and it turns out to be something like empty container or set of all sets. So it remains naive and opaque if its investigations into the being of beings leave the meaning of being in general undiscussed. And precisely the ontological task of a genealogy of the different possible ways of being, a genealogy which is not to be construed deductively, requires a preliminary understanding of what we really mean by this expression being. So ontology and references. And precisely it's interesting that genealogy shows up here, right? It's a very Nietzschean word. Precisely the ontological task of a genealogy of the different possible ways of being, a genealogy which is not to be construed deductively, right? So it's not a deductive, metaphysical, logical breakdown of different possibilities of being, right? It's more that it seems Nietzschean, right? This kind of project of working back the historicality to understand how something developed, right? But it required to do that genealogy of being, right? Which I guess turns out maybe to be what end up being the historical epochs of being in Heidegger's later work. It requires a preliminary understanding of what we really mean by this expression being, right? So you have to have an understanding of the meaning of being if one wants to investigate the being of beings. The question of being thus aims at an a priori condition of the possibility not only of the sciences which investigate beings of such and such a type, and are thereby already involved in an understanding of being, but it aims also at the condition of the possibility of the ontologies which precede the ontic sciences and found them. All ontology, no matter how rich and tightly knit a system of categories it has at its disposal, remains fundamentally blind and perverts its innermost intent if it has not previously clarified the meaning of being sufficiently and grasped this clarification as its fundamental task. Right? So no matter how rich and tightly knit a system of categories could be kind of a dunk on a number of philosophers, it's probably a dunk specifically on Kant. It could also be Hegel, it could be Aristotle, it could be any philosopher who's doing metaphysics, who's building these elaborate structures. You know, Leibniz stands out as someone who might be guilty of this, right? You know, building these elaborate systematic structures, right? But they doing so while still remaining fundamentally blind about the meaning of being. And without having grasped the meaning of being, there's no clarification for the task, right? So there's no fundamental guidance going on here in this task to support it, right? So that's in the sense, I guess, in which the question of being thus aims at an a priori condition of the possibilities of being, because it, right, conditions the possibility not only the sciences which investigate beings of such and such a type, that's just all basic ontic sciences, but the the condition of the possibility of the ontologies which precede the ontic sciences and found them, right? The study of being, philosophy, phenomenology, whatever you want to call it, that is the fundamental basic ground on top of which the other scientific disciplines sit. That too requires an understanding of the meaning of being to clarify the task that it's attempting to follow. Ontological research itself, correctly understood, gives the question of being its ontological priority over and above merely resuming an honored tradition and making progress on a problem until now opaque. But this scholarly scientific priority is not the only one. Right. So we can put this. I guess we didn't get quite as much of a step-by-step discussion with of function, intention, and motives with this one as I was expecting we were going to, right? But so I don't know. Let me double check. Was there did he really say like what the explicit like function, intention, and motives are? I don't think he really did, right? But you can kind of see what they are, right? In the sense that the ontological ground, the function is to ground the ontic sciences, right? To ground the fundamental basic stuff on which the regular, ordinary, everyday, or even just sensually accessible stuff sits. That's the function which it grounds the ontic sciences. That also maybe could be the intention, right? But the intention, I guess, right, is to clarify the meaning of being, right? Right, that it we know what we mean when we say being, right? And we know it in a rich way, right? Because there was all this, like we talked about, there's all this stuff about how it's a moment of crisis in a discipline which fundamentally reworks what appears in that discipline that allows progress, right? So it's like the negative against the positive. And the motives, I don't know what the motives are. Did he give us a sense of what the motives are? I guess, right, yeah, to work out a structure of fundamental concepts, right? Yeah, so we have a ground for the ontic sciences in the function. Our intention is to clarify the meaning of being so that we can do that grounding, and the motives is to work out a structure of fundamental concepts, which is the function, I guess. Maybe that's what he means. I'm not really sure, but that's good enough. Okay, so yes, like I said, we're gonna go a little bit shorter today just because I got a late start. But we will finish this. So I'm going to take a break, and then we'll come back and do the fourth section, the ontic priority of being, which is looks like 4 pages. So actually, it'll take a little bit of time to get us through. That'll take another hour or so. Yeah. So thanks for showing up, everyone. Thanks for chatting. And I will take a break, and then I'll be back. And we'll read some more Heidegger. Thanks, everyone.